Thank you. Yes, so I was, in fact, told, having been invited 11 months before, just 8 days before the CyberCon conference. I have expertise in cybersecurity, and it's the largest cybersecurity conference held in Australia, gets 3,500 people. And I was told that my talk was incongruent with the conference, which was surprising because at the time that they initially made that decision, they only had my title. So it's interesting their ruling talks out by title rather than by content. But having subsequently seen the abstract, they still decided it was incongruent. In fact, it probably, I suspect, had very little to do with that. I wasn't the only speaker who was silenced from speaking. And as I pointed out, I think quite far and wide, the way to improve the cybersecurity of Australia is not to shut down voices. It's actually to encourage discussion and debate, because there's something in cybersecurity where you hire a team of people who actually work for you, but they're going to test the robustness of your defenses. It's called a red team. And the last thing you want on a red team is a red team full of yes men. Because they do not test the robustness of your system. So it was both at odds with academic freedom of expression, but also at odds with basic principles of good cybersecurity. So what I'm actually here to talk about tonight, I'll just keep my clock over here because otherwise I'll run over, is leveling the playing field. And I'm really going to talk about it from a technical perspective, a little bit about what the risks are and how hard it is to actually do that. Now, I think on the one hand, we can think about the citizenry as really being at the forefront increasingly today in the media as being the most vulnerable people in our society being mistreated. So, we've seen a Royal Commission into Aged Care that has come out and said that the standards being used for care of elderly citizens diminishes Australia as a nation. We've had the Productivity Commission determine today that there is really a much greater true cost of mental illness, and that's because it isn't being addressed. And we're seeing repression of journalists through raids on the ABC, the national security reporter at News Limited. We're seeing the silencing of academics, and that silencing was not done by ASA, who was managing the conference. It was commanded by the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. That is a branch of the government. That's a branch of the Australian Signals Directorate. And so we've also seen in the case of, Bernard Collaery, the going after a reprisal of lawyers. So it sort of brings to mind that saying of first they came for the journalists, then they came for the lawyers, then they came for the academics, and all of the vulnerable are also at greater risk. So let's just see if I can get that. Will it go? Yeah. So I do have academic expertise in researching whistleblowing and the impact of digital technology on whistleblowing. In fact, my incongruent talk was about to be, and I might just move this forward slightly because I'm wondering if it's, yeah, I don't know. Can you all hear me? Is there anyone who can? Okay, great. My incongruent talk was actually talking about the different models for digital, secure, and anonymous Dropboxes. And these are being used increasingly in places that have brought in whistleblower protection as a way to protect sources. Increasingly in Europe, they're being used by anti-corruption agencies, notably in Spain. Europe passed a whistleblower protection European directive in April. It was a very exciting moment. I was sitting in the gallery above the plenary to see it go through. And that means that over the next 2 years, all the European Union member states have to pass whistleblower protection legislation that is consistent with that directive. And that directive is actually pretty good. So I've been one of the many people from academia, civil society, who have contributed and worked hard over a number of years towards that coming to pass. And this digital tool of the anonymous digital Dropbox is increasingly being rolled out as a way to implement that more safely for whistleblowers. I will make mention of this other thing, which is I do a bit of work in the space of consumer protection in terms of digital privacy. There's a report, not out yet, coming out soon to a website near you on November 8 with a whole research team that I'm co-leading with Dr. Shanton Chang. And that is supported by the Consumer Policy Center, and that is the state of the art in consumer data tracking and its impact on consumers in Australia. We'll be releasing that on the 8th. So that should be very exciting. Basically, I just really love that cartoon that someone drew of me, so I just had to put it up there because it's very fun. I want to touch on Tom Drake. He was one of the other speakers who was disinvited from speaking at short notice at this large cybersecurity conference. Thomas Drake is a former U.S. National Security Agency executive and an expert in many different areas. He's worked for the CIA and various other defense organizations. But he gave a quote that I really liked, which was from 1984. And part of the reason that he's willing to speak out on issues of government surveillance, and he was a whistleblower, is he said, "I don't want to be Winston cowering in the corner because it's the only place the cameras couldn't reach." I think it's a very telling observation from someone who understands the technology very well. Let's see if we can, get this to go. So one of the things that I've thought a lot about in terms of how you level the playing field is what is the nature of surveillance, because you can't level it if you don't understand it. And this isn't just about what technology is being used to slurp up your information, your metadata every day. That's at one level, one layer, and that's very important, but it's not the only layer. Old surveillance is about listening to what you say. So it's the wiretap on your conversation on the phone, or intercepting your mail and its content, or your chat logs. And that is really about a transaction-based eavesdropping. News surveillance is about who you are. And that is movement and tracking of consumers in public-private places. Interestingly, we've just seen an announcement by the ACCC that they are taking legal action against Google for alleged misrepresentation of whether or not people with Android phones tracking information for their locational data was actually turned off. They had reason to believe that it wasn't turned off, says the ACCC, when in fact, they had reason to believe that it was turned off when in fact it wasn't. It's also increasingly facial recognition and mood analysis. Now, far more concerning than this transition is the next sort of stage 3 transition. And that is, let's see if I can get this to go, the new news surveillance. And the new news surveillance is who we say you are. Now, this is particularly disturbing because it's around interpretations of a consumer and a citizen's capabilities and self. It's based on untested, non-transparent science, and it's potentially used in a discriminatory manner. So that screen that you see there is Biometric Mirror, a wonderful research project also out of Melbourne University's Computing and Information Systems School. That's actually the head of the school there who's been scanned by Biometric Mirror. And this is the kind of thing. Biometric Mirror is based on a database of 10,000 faces. I think it was 3,000 people were asked to assess a set of criteria about these faces. And from that, Biometric Mirror was able to determine who you are, who we say you are. So it's able to say, are you female, what your age is, what your ethnicity is. It said I was Middle Eastern. That's sort of problematic for accuracy, but okay. And it said I was male in one reading, also helpful. It says whether or not you're kind, you've got happiness factor, commonness, level of responsibility, sociability, aggressiveness, etc. It also can give levels of confidence, how confident is the reading. Now you can imagine that it would be easy to get this wrong. And one of the things that I think my fellow researcher found very concerning was that a hiring firm, one of the online recruitment firms, had actually informally approached him to buy this research. To buy this, because you can imagine if you have to do a video online and now this program can actually assess you whether or not you're suitable, but you don't actually know you're being assessed for this. And somehow this assessment of you, of who we say you are, is actually being transported not just across that hiring agency, but any number of possible employers. Or, I don't know, companies that introduce you to who you might want to share a flat with, or who you might want to partner with in life. Any number of things. And so this becomes quite a big implication in our lives. So you can imagine if you're a member of the vulnerable communities in our society, the risk here is that you are potentially read incorrectly. This information is stored about you somewhere. You don't know it. It's sold, merged, transferred, repurposed, reused, and eventually used to discriminate against you. Potentially maybe even things like, I don't know, robo-debt by a private debt company who might have bought the information. Let's see if we can get it going forward. I will just mention a couple of other things. I don't know if any of you have taken a long-haul flight recently. Anyone been on a long-haul plane recently? You may have noticed that there are screens in front of you showing movies. Yeah. So what you may not have noticed is up the top of those screens, there's a little camera. Most people haven't noticed that. When this was pointed out earlier this year, the airlines went, oh, we didn't know it was there, or we didn't turn it on, or we didn't order it, but it came shipped that way. And eventually that answer morphed to, it's not on now, but we might want to use it later. You can see the slippery slope of how this technology is used to collect information about people. A little closer to home, if any of you have been shopping in the Emporium Shopping Center, or for that matter, out at Chadstone, you may have seen these very large boards that advertise different ads rolling. At the top of them is also a camera. What might that camera be doing? Perhaps the same thing as the 7-Eleven petrol station, which is flashing you ads as you fill up your car with petrol. Also over here, you may not know about. Or if you shop at the supermarket and you go to the automated checkout line and you're scanning your goods, you may also have noticed there's a camera at the top of that as well. You can imagine what the implications are of that. So why is this important? Because the kinds of things that are used with potentially this information is the marketing industry tells us what they can do with this data. And they describe it as being the most intelligent out-of-home audience measurement system that anonymously tracking over 2 million Australians weekly. 2 million. I wonder how many of those 2 million know that they're being tracked. And it measures those viewing your content based on age, gender, when they viewed, how many viewed across the entire length of the campaign. That's a little bit about what I said of who we say you are. It reads audience characteristics with precision, identifying 18 demographic profiles, highlights facial features, knows your viewing habits, knows your moods, what is euphemistically referred to as sentiment analysis. It can have a content triggered when the relevant target audience is watching. So now we're in the realm of manipulation. It's not called campaigning, but rather your campaign intelligence. So you are now officially being manipulated. It's not only the commercial sector. So we've seen legislation, some 75 pieces of legislation since 9/11 that have had national security elements, in fact. But we've seen more recently legislation that has been pushed by this federal government, which increasingly encroaches on not only our privacy, but our ability to retain who we are from it being interpreted by other people, summarized, entered into databases. Fortunately, the PJCIS rejected most recently what I refer to, well, it's the Identity Matching Services Bill. I call it the facial slurping bill. But query whether that's going to be back for round 2 in a different form. I think it's quite interesting that the committee rejected it. It's unheard of, really, in recent history. It seems to me almost as though there's been a tipping point we've reached. That tipping point might have been the Your Right to Know campaign. Maybe in some way my matter of academic freedom contributed to it. It might have been the attacks on numerous whistleblowers that have been very visible and really rejected by the Australian people. So previous research I've done, polling Australians, has shown that there is enormous support for whistleblowers to be protected, not punished, even if they're revealing wrongdoing from information inside an organization, in excess of 80%. That's huge numbers for any political advisor. It's easier for law enforcement agencies to identify people in all jurisdictions. And so one of the things that's actually happened here is that you have not just an asymmetry of information where government, the private sector, large tech companies may have more information about you than you have about them. In fact, it's something more than that. I call it asymmetry of anonymity. And that is that you don't even know who has that information about you, but they know everything about you. And that means that there's very little accountability, which means you have a very lopsided playing field. Our model, which at some stage I'll talk about in another forum about our report, is different types of consent for consumers. But it raises some deeper questions on this trying to level the playing field. So one is, do you own the exterior manifestation of yourself? I just had to show that photo because I'm with Dr. Carl and I feel very special in that photo. Can we really talk about digital citizenship if you have no enforceable claim of rights? Do we have the right to know and correct how others read us in a forced consent or no consent environment? That includes government institutions. Our FOI laws are completely ill-equipped to deal with this. Our privacy principles are completely ill-equipped to deal with this next layer of not just who you say you are, but who we say you are. Commercial service providers, other people's consumers who use these services, privacy is really contextual. So one Instagram post versus an entire Twitter feed, it's quite a different thing in terms of someone's privacy. So I think 3 big emerging areas of a concern in terms of leveling the playing field is movement tracking, facial recognition, and mood sentiment analysis. And this issue of how we level this playing field really revolves around this power imbalance, the coercion that occurs with forced consent, the social awareness. So are people aware of how big data and analytics is being used to determine what we say you are? And then also surveillance on top of it. There are not a lot of easy answers for doing this right now. The technology is just like a Star Trek light year ship going to warp drive past the legislator's ability to actually regulate this. And I mean, one of the mechanisms that I think can work is very good whistleblower protection regimes and secure technologies such as encrypted channels to report that, technologically anonymous channels to report wrongdoing is a way of leveling that playing field, but it's not the only way. And we certainly need something bigger than that. One thing I'm quite interested in is whether or not those mechanisms that societies have been developing, including Australia, for the last 20 or so years in whistleblower protection, can be used as models for recourse for those people in our society who are disadvantaged in this new frontier of technological advancement. Again, I don't have easy answers for that. If I had $10 million, I would know the top researchers to hire, and we'd all sit down and put our heads together and actually figure out how to do that. But I think that is certainly one way that we would level the playing field, is to figure out appropriate methods of recourse. And those methods, they can't be robo-debt methods. They have to be methods that involve human beings and human problem solving and adequate resourcing. So I think that's about it for what I've got to say. Thank you very much. Okay.
Well, look, join Julia in acknowledging the Wurundjeri people. The first question that I want to raise with you is just what is corruption? And it's a matter of hot debate in parliamentary circles. No one would attempt to deny that people who engage in serious crime, bribery, matters of that kind, that's corruption. But does it involve a crime? And if you are looking at a level playing field and you see people making enormous donations and getting much better access, well, that strikes me, even though there is no crime involved, as a form of corruption, and certainly it's not a level playing field. It may involve, so far as the government side is concerned, misconduct in public office when you don't give fair attention and consideration to a number of different tenders because one comes from a major donor. Now, what are the defences against corruption in the federal area? Every state now has an anti-corruption commission. The Commonwealth does not. But even the coalition now accepts that we do need a National Integrity Commission of some kind in Canberra. The only relevant bodies for a defence against corruption in Canberra now are ACLI, the Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity, the Public Service Commission, and the Federal Police. And they are, and I will deal with them if you wish later, totally inadequate to provide any good defence against corruption at the present time. There is no adequate control of political donations, lobbying, ministers' diaries are not available, the revolving door movement of ministers and public servants leaving office and moving straight into private industry, where they are of course able to offer enormous access and connections to those who are lucky enough to get them. There is no single body with overall control and full jurisdiction to investigate procurement, nothing to cover defence or health, for example, and the enormous contracts which they are able to offer. As Suelette said, there's totally inadequate FOI, there's totally inadequate protection of whistleblowers. There have been allegations of systemic fraud in the Defence Department. The Age reported them in December of 2018. Now, the Labour Party, the Greens, the Independents have all supported the establishment of a National Integrity Commission, and only lately have the coalition joined the party, but on a very much different model. Now, let me turn then, if, as Tony Abbott once said, we don't need a National Integrity Commission. Canberra is a pretty clean polity on the sort of view that the air changes over Queanbeyan and the nastiness of Sydney and Melbourne just disappears when you get to Canberra. Well, you have to look at just the sorts of things that have been happening over the last decades. Note printing, Australia, and Securency, which were both paying huge bribes to overseas countries to get contracts. The systemic fraud in the Defence Department, no adequate checking of procurements. The submarine contract to the Naval Group. I won't mention what are the obvious things that need investigation. If you want to ask, I'll come back to them later. The contract awarded to the Paladin Company of over $400 million. It was the only tenderer, but they were to provide sort of assistance and guarding to the unfortunates on Manus Island. The company was registered to an island shack on Kangaroo Island. The bugging of the East Timorese cabinet in relation to the negotiations leading to the treaties relating to gas and oil in the Timor Sea, the Watergate scandal, the mismanagement of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, and the number of dams would have been created with the assistance of Commonwealth monies, but to the detriment of the water flowing in the river. The political donations in the 2016 election, there was over $400 million in the period surrounding that election, and a large part of it was in electoral donations. Now, the Crown Casino allegations, uncontrolled lobbying, the Panama Papers, in the ministerial resignations and the revolving door, Andrew Rudd, Julie Bishop, Christopher Pyne. Now, add to that, when you think about these things, when WA Inc. was under consideration, Brian Burke's Leaders account produced many millions of dollars from enthusiastic donors, and the government ran very smoothly for those who had given. Now, the contentious areas when you are looking at what a National Integrity Commission ought to have, first is the definition of corrupt conduct and the width of the jurisdiction the body is to have to look at these various things. It has to cover the situation of the making of a large donation leading to something in return, because that is why large donations are given. They expect reciprocity, and the people in Parliament who receive it want to give that reciprocity. If they don't give reciprocity, they'll cease getting the large donations. So the next contentious area is public hearings, and politicians loathe public hearings because they say their life depends on their reputation, but they are perfectly happy to have judges dealt with in public hearings. There's the 2012 Canberra legislation, the Parliamentary Commission's Judicial Misbehavior Act, which provides that judges who are charged with misbehaviour shall be dealt with in public. What would have happened if the Hayne Commission, which lasted a year, had taken place without public hearings? If the whole thing had been in camera, we wouldn't know what was going wrong in the whole of the banking industry. So the role of anti-corruption commissions is to discover and expose corruption, and for that reason they must have the ability to hold not every hearing in public, but to have them from time to time. The best example of this was the example of Operation Ord, the examination of the Education Department in Victoria. That exposed to Victorians for the first time the fact that we did have rampant corruption in our Education Department. The fact that the hearings took place in public informed the public. It led to a string of witnesses coming forward. It led to plenty of other people complaining about a bit different types of corruption, and the result was that the Education Department instantly, while the hearing was going on, changed its rules and procedures so that that could never happen again. Those are the purposes of having public hearings. The next contentious area is the nature of the report that is intended to be given by the body. The ICAC in Sydney has a power to declare conduct corrupt. Many of those who are now seeking an NIC argue that that is too much, that what an integrity body should be doing is making findings of fact, which can then be challenged on appeal afterwards, which avoids many of the reasons for complaint that have come from those who complain that the ICAC in Sydney has trampled like a kangaroo court over many of the people who've suffered from it. Now, I want to turn to the proposal which has come from the Coalition for an integrity body, and put to you that there are lots of reasons that there must be for change in what they are proposing. They are proposing a body that should be divided into two halves. There's to be a law enforcement integrity part dealing with police, the border force, the bodies which have law enforcement abilities. The weaker part covers the public sector, and it does include parliamentarians and their staff. But the argument that is made by Christian Porter and his Attorney General's Department is somehow that there's heightened risk in the law enforcement areas, something which the rest of us find impossible to detect. We take the view that dividing the body into half is something which is going to lead to demarcation disputes, delay, costly litigation, and it can only be in some way to protect the parliamentarians and those involved in the public service dealing with procurement from the rather nastier investigation that will be involved with the public hearings available from time to time. So far as the definition of corrupt conduct is concerned and the jurisdiction of the body, it has to be wide, because it has to cover the situation of the making of large donations leading to activity by a government, which apparently means that something has been done favourably to a donor. Now, the body has to look at that and say, why is this happening? What proper examination of the competing tenders was undertaken? And when you start out looking at that sort of thing, unless there's a wide definition, you won't get anywhere. And that is one of the things that's wrong with Victoria's IBAC. It's got a very narrow jurisdiction. A good example is the Obeid inquiry, the investigation of the mining licenses in the Bylong Valley. Now, that began because someone rang the ICAC in Sydney and said, there's something funny going on in the Bylong Valley about their mining licenses, you should investigate it. Now, that doesn't suggest anything in a reasonable suspicion of a crime of any kind. No, nothing at all. But they took it from there and they uncovered enormous corruption that was involved. If something like that happened in Victoria, the IBAC couldn't investigate it. Its jurisdiction is not wide enough. Now, so you've got to have an appropriate definition of corruption that goes beyond crime, and you've then got to have a threshold which is not too high to enable an investigation to start. Whistleblower complaints. The coalition model does not allow an individual to make a complaint to it, which is extraordinary. It does not allow any form of public hearings at all, and you can find that if you look at the body which was announced by Porter at the end of 2018. It's available for examination, and we're waiting with great interest to see the exposure draft, which is said to be going to arrive very shortly. He announced it and said you'll have a bill within 12 months. Well, there's not much sign of it appearing, and there's been so much abuse thrown at Porter's model in the intervening 12 months that no doubt they're thinking rather seriously before they put it out. What is clear is that when the CIC, designed by Porter, has an investigation, there won't be a hearing, and when it gets to the end of it, all it can do is put in the hands of the DPP any proposal for prosecution that the body thinks may be appropriate on the facts it's discovered. Now, translate that into the Hayne Commission, assume that he'd been investigating under Porter's CIC model, you wouldn't have heard at all from the start to finish what had been discovered, and you wouldn't have got to anything until someone started being prosecuted. And if the relevant Director of Public Prosecutions decided, well, look, there isn't really enough evidence, and I don't think I'll prosecute, you'd never get to hear of it at all. Now, the CIC model, therefore, will not permit any investigation of electoral donations or their consequences, or the revolving door movement of ministers and public servants. It demonstrates that all the coalition wants is investigation of serious, obvious criminal activity. Andrew Wilkie said recently that returning favour for favour goes on every day in the Commonwealth Parliament. The Coalition doesn't want that investigated. So the only other thing I wanted to say is that we had the IBAC model produced in Victoria in 2011. The Baillieu government was elected. It was elected on a promise that if elected, it would establish an anti-corruption commission closely modelled on the New South Wales ICAC. And I was part of the panel advising the Baillieu government on how to establish its IBAC. We produced a report of 250 pages in 3 months. I don't think they read a page of it, and what they produced was a paper tiger, very rapidly described as such by Tim Smith and the Accountability Roundtable. You could not, under that body, begin an investigation until you were able to articulate the facts of the investigation sufficient to enable, if proved in a court beyond reasonable doubt, demonstrating corruption. So you had to know the entire facts that you want to investigate before you could start. When the Andrews government was elected, it promised to make substantial changes. I'm sorry to say that the Andrews government is not in the least enthusiastic about either transparency or accountability. The legislation in Victoria, Section 117, was already highly restrictive about public hearings before the Andrews government was elected. Since then, the Andrews government has put further restrictions on public hearings, making it even more difficult. And the worst thing I can say about the IBAC is that when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister and was considering an integrity commission, he said, well, look, of all the models I can think of, I think I like best the Victorian one. It really, apart from Operation Ord and a couple of very successful police inquiries, it's done very little that we know of publicly. It's only had 7 public hearings in the 7 years since it was set up. Now, the legislation in Victoria is still too narrow, and it's still too hard to have a public inquiry. And as far as our politicians are concerned, well, people say to me that the Coalition is wholly opposed to a National Integrity Commission in Canberra, and the Labor Party isn't really much more enthusiastic about it either.